Hello, welcome to the session number 2, video number 2, process group activities. Let's have a look at the project management processes according to PMBOK. I already told you that at the 7th and 8th sessions, we are going to discuss about the Prince 2, in which we will try to relate what we have discussed so far during the first 6 lectures in that session. Until then, let's have a look at the processes recommended by the PMBOK. So there are 5 major processes that the project teams have to work on. They are namely initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. In every stage, there are certain set of activities that have to happen. Example, during the initiating, you come up with the project objectives, project manager identified, constraints identified, and authorization for the project is provided. So this, at the end of the initiating state, your project is approved to proceed. During the planning, what kind of activities would be done? Quite a few. Out of these, coming up with a statement of work, planning on the project, coming up with a project management plan, coming up with a project glossary that talks about various technical jargons to be used within your project implementation, establishing the rate, doing the rate analysis that talks about 4 things: risk, assumptions, issues, and dependencies. Also, you will do any updates to the project management plan. That is what you're talking about the project planning. You can make certain adjustments to the planning that you have already done. So at the end of the planning, you start the execution. That is the time you start building. So during the execution, your project deliverables are being developed. You also look for deliverable acceptance. When you complete a particular deliverable, you need to reach out to the client and seek the acceptance. Actual effort and complete data. Also, you work on change requests. If there are any deviations identified, defects identified, certain enhancements that identified by the stakeholders as well as by the team, you start implementing those changes. You'll also come across issues and resolutions for those issues during the execution. So while you're working on planning and then executing, one another thing that will happen is monitoring and controlling. You will start observing and monitoring what is happening around planning and execution, and accordingly control it. Controlling is done keeping the end goal, the requirement set in mind. Your aim is to be in line with those requirements and the standards that you have agreed. Any moment the team is moving away from agreements, then you need to control. So during the controlling, some of the activities that you would do is track the performance, plan change request, change management results will be evaluated, as well as issue management results. So during controlling, while looking at the execution and the planning, you're going to plan and execute change request and resolutions for issues. So once you will continue execution, once you reach towards the completion of the project, you approach the closing. Closing is one of the tough jobs for the project manager because this is the stage where you try to close the project. So these are some of the activities that you do during this phase. Product and vendor evaluations. You start asking the vendors and the client to evaluate the product. You also try to get the acceptance documentation completed. That is sending the product to the client and stakeholders, asking them to get back to you in writing with their confirmation. Legal, contract, and budget clause. So any budgetary concerns, the contracting areas have to be closed at the end of this phase. You need to archive the projects, you need to back up the projects for future use. Redeploy resources. This is to redeploy the people into the other projects and teams since you will not have further work to be carried out. Generally what could happen is you will come up with a support team for some time with the acceptance of the client, and then retain that support team, which is a subset of your complete team, until the client is happy to completely close the project. You'll also talk about the outstanding issues and changes, right? Also start monitoring the production level issues. Any issues come up, you need to start processing them appropriately. Of course, this is done only if the client wants you to keep working towards those issues and changes. All in all, so these 5 phases of the project life cycle will allow you to ensure that you have taken care of the requirements and then taken steps to complete the project and close it. So at the end of the closing, as I told you already, ongoing cross-project improvements can happen. Generally, the clients would keep a support team, a business as usual team, just to ensure that they have sufficient coverage to tackle any production issues that will come up. So let's have a look at these process groups quickly. The first process group is initiating process. So let's have a look at some of the activities that you do in this. Identify a project manager and the team. So one of your primary activities to do in this phase is to identify the project manager and its team. Determine company culture and existing systems. So you also need to go through the existing systems, the culture, and then be familiar with it. Collect processes, procedures, and historical information. This is very crucial when you are particularly new to the process, the procedures, and the company. Collecting process procedural information will help you to understand the process and procedures better. Then decide the project scope. You need to finalize the project scope at this stage. Also understand the business case. Why are we trying to work as a project team? You need to understand the business context, business reason why the project is to be initiated. Uncover initial requirements and risk. So during the initiating process groups, you also spend some time understanding the initial requirements. You might not have to have in detail requirements at this stage, but at least you need to know it at a high level. Create measurable objectives. Before you jump into the other phases of the project development, you need to understand the objectives with measurable criteria. So the objectives have to be measurable. Develop the project charter. Of course, a crucial step activity during the initiating At the end of the initiating phase, you need to have the project charter finalized and signed off by the stakeholders. You also identify the stakeholders, so stakeholders will be listed in your project chart as well. Develop stakeholder management strategy. During the initiating phase, you will also create stakeholder management strategy, that is to effectively manage the stakeholders of your project. Now let's move on to the next phase, that is planning process group. So let's have a look at the activities done during the planning process. One thing that you will start doing is determining how you will do the planning. So as you step into the planning process, you need to figure out how effectively you will plan. Finalize the requirements. During the planning, of course, your requirements have to be finalized. Create project scope statement, then you refine the project scope statement. Maybe during the initiating phase, you have initiated creating the scope statement. At this stage, you're gonna finalize the scope statement. Determine what to purchase. Anything that you need to purchase needs to be decided and move towards planning in detail. You also determine the team. You may not acquire it, you may just determine it. You need to know who are the resources to be involved in your project. You need to finalize that. Create work breakdown structure and work breakdown structure dictionary. Work breakdown structure is the tool that is used to break down your big project requirement into smaller chunks. In this process, you are trying to identify the work packages that you can deliver during your project execution. Going further, after the work packages, you may also identify the specific activities in your WBS. Create activity list. So that's what I just spoke about. Some of the other things that you do during the planning process are creating the network diagram. In terms of planning, coming up with a network diagram is a very critical step. This will allow you to understand the complexity as well as the sequence of the activities to carry out. Then you start estimating the resource requirements. How many resources do we need? At what times and what durations we need these resources? That is to be estimated. Also, you estimate the time and costing, or you need to come up with the time estimates for the activities that you have identified, and as well as derive at the duration required in order to carry out those activities, right? This will also allow you to come up with the budget forecast, costing for your project implementation. After doing your planning, mainly the network diagram and then the work breakdown structure, you will be in a position to identify the critical path. Critical path is the baseline of activities that you have to carry out in order to complete the project. So the critical path have to be met. In case you miss out any steps, any activities in the critical path, your project will not be a successful one. So you, at the end of the planning phase, you develop the schedule, you develop the budget, and determine the quality standards, procedures, and metrics that have to be adopted during the project implementation. As you realize, you see that there are a lot of activities to carry out during the planning process. Now, this is the same reason why we discuss the term BDUF. If you remember, BDUF stands for Big Design Upfront. So there are a lot of planning, very comprehensive planning that has to happen during the planning process. Sometimes these activities will be overwhelmed, these will be too much for certain project implementation. So as the project manager, project team, you may need to design what appropriate activities that you need to end up doing. However, we are discussing all the things that you need to do, and when you start project managing, you probably need to decide what specific activities you must work on, right? So the next set of activities that you have to do, that you can do during the planning process groups, are creating the process improvement plan. Another thing is, during your project you may also identify certain areas of improvement in process perspective. Then determining all roles and responsibilities is a very critical activity, kind of a must, to ensure that you have a very clear understanding about the people involved and their responsibilities. So we will talk a bit further later on this particular topic. You also need to plan communications. Also, you perform risk identification, quantitative and qualitative risk analysis, and risk response planning. Very crucial activity. This is a must happen. And in that, what you try to do is assess the risks occurred and that could occur during your project implementation, and then come up with responses to tackle those risks effectively. Uh, Finally, you need to go back and try to adjust the things that you have done. So this is basically talking about the iteration. So we already spoke about the iterative and incremental model. Being waterfallish, being sequential, it doesn't leave a lot of room for you to go back. But in all possible cases, your effort must be to go back and adjust things. Providing you get the customer buy-in, you should be able to do it. But if the clients will not support it, the model is not very much supportive to go into the iterations and adjust what you have done. During the planning, you also prepare the procurement documents. Any procurement that needs to happen will need to be planned. Finalize how to execute and control parts of all management plans. While you are coming up with your plan, you need to plan how exactly you can execute and control. So it's kind of a detailed planning that you do during the planning process. Develop final project management plan and perform measurement baseline that are realistic. So at the end of it, you're going to create a project management plan, which is the integrated planning document that you come up, basing all the other planning that you do. That includes the scope, time, cost, procurement, risk, everything put together into one single project management plan. So at the end of the planning, you need to gain the formal approval of the plan. So this is a crucial step, particularly talking about the traditional approaches where we approach the development in a sequential manner. Gaining the approval before you jump into the development phase is a must. Otherwise, you will not have the customer buy-in, you will not have the necessary funding. So try and get the formal approval before you jump into the next phase, that is execution. At the end of the planning, we generally hold a kickoff meeting. That is to finalize the planning we have done, acknowledge and get the formal approval from all the stakeholders and the clients. Now let's have a look at the next process group, that is executing process group. So these are some of the activities that we do during this process group. Execute the work according to the project management plan. So by the time you come to the executing process, You have a project management plan signed off by your stakeholders. So you start executing the work according to that project management plan. Also, you produce product scope. You can further elaborate on the product scope that is being worked out. There can be changes requested, therefore accommodating those changes will happen during the executing process as well. You implement only the approved changes. Remember, particularly following traditional approaches like PMBOK, Prince2, waterfall or software development life cycle, it's very crucial that you stick to the changes that have been approved by the stakeholders, nothing else. You're not trying to do extra features. You also need to ensure common understanding is established. Everything you do needs to be acknowledged and agreed by your stakeholders and your team. Mostly this is an overlooked area. We tend to do work on our own silos, assuming that what we do is the right thing, but we end up knowing that what we do is not in line with what the team and stakeholders really want us to do. So be careful there. You also use the work authorization system here. How the changes been evaluated, reviewed, approved, as well as how the work is distributed through proper authorization. This is followed by the traditional leadership approach, where we have a leader who authorizes the work that we do. We also try to continuously improve during the executing process growth. The continuous improvement can happen on the product as well as on the process. The product improvements could be benefiting the client, but that's it. Any improvement that you work has to be discussed and agreed. The process perspective is focusing on how do we work, how could we work as a team. So there can be certain improvements identified, agreed between your team members, and then proceeded with the actions. The next set of activities that you would do would be following the processes. During the executing process, you also have to follow various processes agreed by the project team and stakeholders. You perform quality assurance, absolute must. So in traditional teams, this is kind of strong area, but we need to focus heavily on the quality assurance aspect. You also perform quality audits. The audits could be internal as well as external. Internal audits are focused on assuring the quality of the product that you develop. The external audits are focusing on finding out the corrective and preventive actions. Of course, during the internal quality assurance, you also work on you also focus on the preventive and corrective actions, but these preventive and corrective actions will come as change requests. During the executing, you acquire the final team. I would say this is one of the initial steps that you have to activities that you have to do as you start the executing process. You acquire the final team. Then you start managing people in that team. That can happen during the execution. Evaluate the team and project performance. Another thing that you have to do as a project manager is to evaluate your team regularly. That is to look at what they do, give proper feedback, help them to ensure and focus effectively. You also need to look at the project performance, how the project is doing over the period of time you have spent so far. So based on what you see, you probably need to start monitoring and controlling. That we will discuss later. Hold the team building activities. During the executing process, you'll also have to work towards team building activities. ensuring that your team is becoming a high-performing team. This needs a lot of skills from you and a lot of effort from you and to master the skills needed to build a high-performing team, and then basically coach and mentor people in your team. All right, so some of the other activities done during the executing process groups, you give recognition and rewards for your people. It's important that you recognize them, recognize the team, reward them appropriately. Also, you start keeping track of the issues. Generally, my recommendation is to create a central document to keep track of 4 different things. It's called RAID analysis. So in this RAID analysis, you are keeping track of risks, issues, assumptions, and dependencies. So you also facilitate conflict resolution. As a project manager or a project leader, you will need to let the team navigate through the conflicts and resolve them. It's a particular art as well as a competency that you have to gain as a project leader. You send and receive information. Of course, there'll be a lot of information that is exchanged between you and other people involved. That includes stakeholders and clients. You hold a lot of meetings time to time to plan further, look back, go through the work that is to be planned and executed. There'll be a lot of meetings that have to happen. Of course, you need to facilitate them. You also select the sellers, which is crucial, I guess. To sell the product, you need to know who will be the sellers for you. All right, so far we discussed 3 process groups: initiating, planning, and executing. Now let's have a look at the 4th process group, that is monitoring and controlling process group. So in this process, there are many activities to happen. The intention of this particular process is to observe what's happening in the execution and the planning and adjust to get back on track. So let's see what exactly you will do, right? One thing that you're going to do is you're going to take action to control the project. So that is looking at what is happening and what is being planned, determining any deviations that has occurred. You need to come up with actions to fix them. You also start measuring performance of the project. That is looking at the defects, the bug rate, how effectively you work towards the project implementation. In terms of the cost, the schedule, as well as the scope. So you need to start measuring the performance and then adjust accordingly. You also determine variances and if they warrant a change request. So while you're looking at the project progress, you need to figure out any deviations, variances that have happened in the schedule, the budget, or the scope. If there are any deviations, you need to come up with certain change request. You influence the factors that cause changes. So basically, if there are any changes that are proposed, you probably need to start discussing about them and try to influence the factors, right? For example, say there's a lot of change requests are coming due to the fact that our quality practices, quality assurance practices are not so great. So you need to figure out the root cause and then influence that root cause to fix those issues. That way, you will be able to move and proceed effectively than what you do now. So we already discussed changing request is something that you do during the monitoring and controlling. When you see any deviation, any variation, you need to request a change. So that needs to go through an approval process, and then once it's approved, you're going to execute that. Okay. You perform integrated change control. That is basically what integration change control means is integrating changes cannot be done isolatedly. That means you come up with a change request to fix a particular issue. Just looking at that issue, you might not be able to proceed because the solution that you implement might be a very complex one. There can be many interdependent components, different units that are associated with what you work on. So therefore, you need to look at the relation between what you work as well as other components. So implementing a change has to be done with close supervision, close monitoring of other activities that are affected. So if there are any dependent components, activities, you need to ensure that those components and activities are in line with the change that you try to implement. So during the monitoring and controlling process, you approve or reject changes. So I told you it goes through an approval process. So during that process, you can either approve or reject the changes. Inform stakeholders of approved changes. Once the changes are approved, you need to loop all the stakeholders and inform them about the changes being approved. You manage configuration. Configuration is a process where you look at all the components associated with a particular system and then put them all together. So you need to manage the configuration effectively. Create forecasts. During the monitoring and controlling, you will also look at the forecasting. In terms of the budget and schedule, you may need to readjust the forecast that you have done during the planning. You try to gain the acceptance from the customer. So while you are trying to monitor and control the project, you also need to seek acceptance from the client. Perform quality control. That is, there'll be separate quality controlling teams who will work with the project team to ensure that they help the team to quality control. All right, so during the monitoring and controlling process, you report on project performance. As a project manager, if you work as a project manager, it's a must that you start reporting the project performance to the stakeholders and your clients. This will allow them to get the right visibility, get to know what's happening in terms of the project progress. Also, you perform risk audits. It could be done internally by some team members, or it can be done by people outside the team. So you go through the risk register, ensure that these risks are being looked into, and then come up with the risk responses. When you see any deviations in terms of tracking the risk and responding to those risks, you need to come up with action items. As a result of the risk audits, you will have change requests, action items agreed and presented to the team. During the monitoring and controlling process, you will also manage reserves. What a reserve is, it's a buffering timeline or funding that is allocated for the project, but the reserves will only be used if needed. Your effort is to manage your project within the baseline. So when you are not able to meet the project requirements using the baseline planning, then you need to step into your reserves. There can be management reserves, there can be different types of reserves. So managing reserves is also a part of this particular process growth. You also administer the procurements, looking at the procurement needs, the procurement that are being contracted. You work further towards effective administration of procurements to ensure that right amount of right procurements are being utilized and they are according to the plan. All right, so we have discussed all the four phases and we are to talk about the last processing group, that is closing process group. Let's have a look at what exactly you will be expected to carry out during this process group. So you confirm the work that is completed by your project team. You also complete procurement closure, right? You need to ensure that all the procurements are closed effectively and then redeployed to other projects and teams. You gain the formal acceptance. As a project manager, gaining the project acceptance is one of the critical jobs that you have to do, right? Your ability to influence the client to show that you have done your part, the team has completed the project is extremely challenging, but of course, you know, this is a mandated job. So try and gain the formal acceptance during the closing process. You complete the final performance reporting as well. Right now you need to come up with a comprehensive final report indicating the performance demonstrated during the project. If there are any deviations, they will be highlighted in your report as well. Index and archive records. So at the end of the project, before you dissolve your team, you need to archive and index the records. Archiving is to ensure that you have those records available for future use. Indexing is to easily locate them in future instances. One other activity that you have to do is update the lessons learned document. During the project life cycle, you will try to maintain a document called lessons learned. That is to update all the lessons that you learned during the project execution, project life cycle. So at the end of the project, during the closing process, also you update the lessons learned document. You hand off completed product to the client and stakeholders. Also release resources to other projects. We call it adjourning the teams, dissolving the team and letting people go and work for other teams is what you do at the end. So with that, we have completed the session number 2, and what is up next is session number 3. In that, we are going to discuss the process groups in detail. See you there.